third public meeting of my study group titled Archives and Regeneration, with the subtitle, What Can Be Kept in the Face of Flux? Tonight, our guest speaker is the Hague-based artist and writer Vibeke Mascini. She will be giving a talk on regeneration as a nonlinear framework, embodied landscapes, and global scales of proximity. And she will discuss how regeneration is reflected in her works. I met Vibeke in Delphina Foundation. We both attended the program titled Future Rituals in 2020, January and February. Vibeke's research often looks into historic and futuristic concepts of electricity as a speculative agent of life. Among the outcomes is the sound installation Salvage from 2019, for which a new form of battery was developed that harnessed the energy released from the burning the remains of a stranded whale. Frequently in collaboration with scientists, engineers, music composers, as well as government employees, Vibeke Mascini seeks to channel an intimate understanding of electricity by drawing a direct relation to its source with her sculptures, installations, videos, and texts. Her works have been included in international collections such as MoMA Library, New York, Academisch Medisch Centrum, Amsterdam, Columbia University Library, New York, and Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. So, welcome, dear Vibeke. I leave the stage to you.
Thank you, Sena, for this introduction and this invitation for tonight. It's an absolute joy to be part of this study group and to continue a conversation you and I have started early this year on a shared interest into movements of energy and regeneration, among many other shared interests we have. I will start by speaking on the ways in which I've been exploring energy within my practice, within my art practice, and specifically on how electricity generation from unlikely sources has grown to be a central force within my work. I will take you through some images. Please feel free to interrupt. I know that whoever is watching can also pose questions. So I will do my best to, if it makes sense in the meantime, and otherwise certainly answer them after. So it's only recently that I started to really experience electricity in an aware way. Of course, I've been looking at lightning strikes against the sky in awe for as long as I can remember. And I switch the light in my house on as soon as it gets dark, and I charge my phone daily. But there's an abstraction to this force that did not allow me to relate to electricity much, or let alone be intimate with it. And it felt rather neutral to me, as it might to many people, and even a bit sterile. But that was until I learned that stranded whales are turned into electricity. And to be more precise, in the country where I live, which is the Netherlands, dead stranded whales are collected, and from the process of incinerating their bodies, which contain large amounts of oil, electricity is generated. And this whale energy is part of the central grid, the electricity grid, together with energy derived from coal, wind, from sun, and from nuclear reactions, amongst other things. And so as I got to know that, and as it got dark that evening, and I switched on my light again, I realized it might well be the whale energy entering my house. Switch, just like that. So which, at least in my experience, would be an entirely different energy, one that I could relate to. But the infrastructure of the electricity grid does not allow to differentiate between different sources of energy or to draw a direct relation to its source. So you might buy so-called green energy, as I do, but this is not necessarily what comes out of the socket in your wall. And I wanted to be able to use energy from a specific source, which is why I started working on realizing a whale battery. And by which I mean a battery storage that houses pure whale energy collected directly from the power plant after a whale got stranded in 2018 on the coast of Scheveningen. And this was the occasion in which I was able to do that, to realize that whale energy. And so this was a battery. You see it here. I used Tesla batteries for this, repurposed Tesla batteries, because they so happen to be the most energy efficient storage spaces at the time that I was working on this project. And this was a project that contained a lot of negotiation with government employees, scientists, mechanics, to work on this project, in which I was able to harness the energy derived from that stranded whale, that processed stranded whale. And it became part of a sound installation I made, which you see here, where the whale battery powers an automatic player piano to perform a sound composition. And this composition was a direct translation of a scientific recording of humpback whale communication. You see here the white object in the instrument is actually the music composition. So on it, this is the carrier of that sound information. And here you see it even further. So what I could do by using scientific recordings of humpback whale communication, I could translate these sound frequencies into the sound frequencies available within the reach of an automatic player piano. And of course, the fat of a whale is by itself a sort of a biological battery. It's a highly efficient energy storage, which makes each man-made battery seem incredibly primitive. Just for an example, when you would want to store an entire whale, the amount of energy that an entire sort of whale that you would see in a comic book, the entire energy that that whale would hold in its body, if you would want to store that in one-on-one battery, that battery would be twice the size of that same whale. So just to give you an example of how even with our most modern technology, the batteries that we have at hand are incredibly primitive versions of an energy storage, which is of course the case if you compare it to the storage of fat, of whale fat, of oil that has been developed over millions and millions of years. So unlike electricity derived from whale fat itself was very hard to get my hands on, or get your hands on in general. But in the Netherlands, we have a law which protects any material from the whale body to not be owned legally, it doesn't allow ownership, which got me all the more curious about this relation between the source from which the electricity was generated and the electricity itself. Since the source was so protected, but the electricity derived from it became available to all. And so there was this huge discrepancy that got me very curious to that transition that takes place in between, to that incineration process. And the attachment that we have, or the disattachment that we have to that process. And because what in the process of incineration was exactly destroyed, I wondered, and what was in its place generated. And after quite some negotiation and a legal contract, I got to work with whale fat, from which you see here in the picture. This is a bucket of so-called spermaceti, coming from the head of a sperm whale, which stranded at Texel, also in the Netherlands, in 2017. And I got to work with this material under the contract that I was not an owner, but instead a caretaker. So I could work with it, with the material, but I could never use it in a sense that it would be used, so that it would be used and nothing would be left. So I had a very particular relation to this material that I could mold but not make disappear. And what I decided to do with it, I decided to follow a very old tradition that this material has been prone to, which is to make a large candle. And this is the process of that candle making. This is the pressing out of the oil and collecting the wax that is inside that material. And I made this wax into this large candle that you see here, which was part of an installation I called This Giant Time. And it was referring to this biological time stored inside the fat of this whale, this potency, and simultaneously to the human-oriented clock time, as the candle was rotating on like a time's arm, synchronized to every standardized clock. And that is the sort of motorization that you see behind that candle, and also an antenna that was picking up the signal in Frankfurt, which is the sort of where the standardized clock beats, so to say. And this work for me posed an interesting problem, since I did not legally own the whale fat with which I started to make the work. But as I said, I was a legal caretaker. And so I didn't know if I actually, and I'm still exploring, if I actually own this work, or if I'm still having the relation of the caretaker of something that I made, which I thought was a very interesting relation to something that I've been working on, and I never faced that so far. And this questionable ownership became a very important element for other works I started working on. So, for instance, for this second battery work that I'm currently working on, which evolves around a battery charged with another source of specific electricity. Because in an ongoing research on unlikely sources of electricity, I got to know that the fate of confiscated cocaine was similar to that of a stranded dead whale. For also batches of cocaine intercepted by customs are destroyed by incineration, from which electricity is generated. And this incineration process to me is incredibly interesting, since it defines the radical end of an illegal product, cocaine, a product with a large market value. And simultaneously, it shows it has the simultaneous generation of a neutral building block. So with the destruction of the cocaine, a neutral building block called electricity is generated. And it's a process of dismantling, in a way. And so this material is taken out of circulation, the cocaine, as you see here, being collected by customs. So it's being taken out of the circulation of the market, but yet its energetic counterpart enters circulation on the grid. And this got me really thinking about these type of circulations and what we allow freely to circulate on one place and don't allow to circulate in another. And here you see some images of that process. Here you see a testing of one of those gray blocks that you saw in the previous image to do a testing if it is indeed cocaine. And this is a project currently in process, and I encounter a high confidential. Is of high confidential nature. And this is also something I'm encountering in this project. I'm generally used to make quite some documentation of the process of my works. But in this case, I'm really hitting a wall in that regard, because there is a lot of, because it works with this illegal material. I'm really noticing that to get access to it is very, very complex, very difficult, and also to share that is quite. I'm quite restricted in that. So so this is why I don't have so much imagery on this so far, which is a very interesting thing for me because it also puts all the more weight on that sort of transformation that takes place after it is incinerated, because up to the point of incineration, it's being protected by police forces, by what's the word for that? A high person of justice. I don't know exactly the English word right now, but and it's being sort of certified with a certification of destruction. So that's the common protocol. But then once it is destroyed and once it is turned into electricity, or electricity is the byproduct of it, or the product of it, at that point it is free for all again, which we've also encountered with the whale fat. So I cannot show you so much of that process so far, but I will show you the other element of the installation that I'm currently working on, and the other element being these pupae of moth, which you see here laying in my hand. And these pupae are, as you might know, one of the stages of the what so far has been a caterpillar, and is in the process of pupating, or undergoing a radical metamorphosis as well. And I'm planning to present this work in the spring of next year. So I will then guide you to another battery project I'm currently developing. And it's one that will be charged in the Swiss Alps. Mm-hmm.
We can start.
Okay. So I'll try to patch it back.
So we have a small technical issue, and we are continuing from this image.
So in this image, you see another element of the installation for which I use, or which will be coupled with the battery that stores the cocaine energy, so to say, or the energy derived from the destruction through incineration of cocaine confiscated by customs. And the other element being these objects that you see here laying in my hand, which are the pupae of moth. So they are a particular stage of these insects in which they actually are going through this process of a radical metamorphosis, of turning into, one can almost say, another species, but based on the same, going through this process of regeneration based on the same building blocks that they have had all their lives. So, so they will be the counterpart of that project. And I think I will move on then to this project, to introducing it. And it's yet another battery project I'm currently developing. One for which I've traveled and will travel again to the Swiss Alps, because there I'm looking into an entirely different scale of destruction that leads to electricity generation, the melting of a glacier, which is increasingly sped up by global warming at the moment. Here you see a part of that power plant in the southeast of Switzerland. And the reason why from now on some images will be black and white is not because I entered a new stage of of directing, or of cinematographic vision, but it was rather that my Swiss German is rather poor, and when I bought film for my analog camera, I accidentally bought black and white film. So that is the only reason for that. But it adds some drama to the chapter of this presentation, which I'm all right with. So here I will take you to some images of that power plant. I went there to visit the installation, also to get a sense of how this infrastructure goes about collecting or utilizing actually the process of the destruction of that glacier and turning it into something as energy. And because with the generation of this electricity, this company that we're standing in right now manages to harness a landscape in the process of destruction, something that we can consider to be a natural catastrophe. And the melting of a glacier becomes the electric source in that process that powers the mundane activities of the people that live in the vast surroundings. And here you see on the screens a bit of the setup in which very abstractly you see sort of how through different collections or pools of water where that melting water is collected and is being dropped, and that activity, that hydraulic force is then from that force electricity is generated. But I got really interested in this particular infrastructure because it uses such a different scale. It considers the powering of electricity on such a different scale than my previous projects. As I said, a whale contains quite some energy, but of course, if you consider a landscape and consider a glacier, the potency that it has is enormous. And just to think in terms of the destruction of that particular landscape and how that can be turned into something, into a process that is both extremely efficient and almost monstrous, in the sense that it utilizes something that we can consider, as I said, a catastrophe. And that transition, I think, is one that I'm currently very interested in and I'm currently exploring, because also it makes the users of that electricity, gives them a very particular role, since it is making of them in some way, it makes all of these users complicit in the process of that thawing landscape. And here you see the electricity, once it is generated, moving through that space. And it was very striking in seeing that facility, which was run by incredibly kind people, I have to say, how many parallels there are between water and the current of water and the current of electricity, which is, of course, also when you are in school and you're being taught what the flow of electricity is, there will often be references to the flow of water. And I believe that, or I've come to realize that in my research with these different facilities, these different infrastructures of electricity generation, what I'm actually exploring is the notion that I believe that we feel intimate, that if we feel an intimate relationship to something, that we will also change our ways towards it, or our feeling towards it, and our actions towards it. I believe that if we feel intimate to something, that we will take more care. And that's something I'm also exploring with all these different installations. And also in a way with this work that I will tell you about now, which I finished or developed this year in a collaboration, an incredibly interesting collaboration with a specialist working with wave analysis. So he has he works on analyzing ocean waves with the general purpose of constructing docks, harbors, and ocean platforms. He examines wave patterns that can be traced back to their origin, or to be more precise, from a wave that he measures in the Pacific, he can deduct what the weather conditions above the Indian Ocean were several days before. So he's able to make these so-called, I consider them a bit hindcasts, these ways of looking back into a different place, but also a different time. And he helped me to faithfully translate a series of so-called swell waves. And swell waves are such waves shaped by distant weather systems. So they are not locally shaped, but they are shaped as a result of something that happened somewhere else. And these swell waves that I started working on with his help were a series of waves measured on the Orkney Islands, from which it was calculated that they had been shaped about 4 days before on the southern Atlantic Ocean. And I got in contact with him because I wanted to translate these waves into a wave that could take place on a grand piano, which is what you see here. And of course, waves, or the grand piano, the movement on these keys, they are generally related to sound, but I really wanted to have a focus on the movement rather that surface is able to produce. So we go to some video documentation here to see that work. So, as you could see, it was not a mistake for your speakers. It was a really a muted instrument on which it took place. And I've been very curious with this project to consider these swell waves that I've been introduced to by this wave expert. Which, by the way, I think is the coolest title to have. But I was really, very excited to think how a wave can put us in direct and intimate contact with the weather on the other side of the world. And just that realization, I thought was, it means that this wave can bridge a distant location as well as a distant time, and sometimes as much as 10 days prior, that the wave that might reach one point of the world has been originated at the other. So it's really a sort of a ripple effect, an example of a ripple effect on such a global scale. And I think scaling down is something that I keep encountering in my work. So that I believe it's a very powerful tool as a way so that we can relate, that we can see ourselves in relation, energetically, materially, elementary. And that's that would bring me to also to a project which is the most recent project I worked on. It was called This Body That Once Was You. And it was a collaboration with curator and artist Babs Bakels. And this was it was an individual audio experience, a space in which an audio experience took place that was able to visit one person at the time. And it was a piece that has been much departing or rooted in an ancient Buddhist tradition, the 9 cemetery contemplations, which is a practice that focuses specifically on physical detachment and death consciousness, by guiding the listener or guiding the person, by guiding yourself, by meditating on the dissolution of the body after death. And this takes place in 9 stages, all the way from the last breath to the moment in which bones turn to dust. And this is an old Buddhist tradition that we departed from as a way of thinking about physical dissolution, of the falling apart, literally, as physical as it can get, into falling apart from a collection that we call one person, being, into all types of elemental cycles. And so we made an interpretation on that very ancient tradition, which was experienced like this. One was seated, one was asked to sit on a chair, and surrounded by this nebula on the ground. It was a field made of dust that we derived from human bone. It was a very fine powder. It was almost this this moment, which also Babs Bakels, who I collaborated with, is very interested in, when does that switch take place, when from a subject we, which is almost like a taboo, we become these objects, we become matter, and we are matter, but we definitely become matter at that stage. And so we took that as a departure point, that tradition, and made an experience, an audio experience that really even goes into sort of meditating on the dissolution up till the moment in which DNA even falls apart. And this is something that we managed to do also much in collaboration, in conversation with many scientists that we also invited to respond to that meditation and to that Buddhist tradition, which is something we first underwent ourselves with the help of an incredible Buddhist teacher. And it was really a very interesting way to think of that returning to the chain of elements on a very physical level, very, very elemental level. And it became really a moment or an occasion for very interesting conversations in this space that took place in this space afterwards. And I will just say one last thing about this installation, and I think I would round it up then, but I thought it was so striking because we had placed that installation there, and we had known that it was a former hospital, so which by now has turned into living spaces, artist studios. But we didn't know up till the point that this exhibition took place there, or this installation took place there, that this was actually the nativity room, or no, wait, I'm saying that wrong, but the place where women would give birth. So it was really a project that was that came full circle in that way. And here you see a detail of something we had also not foreseen, but as sometimes happens, these sort of beautiful coincidences take place. Since we had let the dust settle of that bone powder, and only the day after already we found these traces of these uninvited guests that are generally present in a space, but only now became visible. So these little insects, and I think I will probably leave it at that and see and be very curious at this point what you would have to respond, have to think, what responses have occurred. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Vibeke. I have many thoughts in my mind. At the moment, we don't have any questions from the public, but we still have time for questions to arrive. In the meanwhile, I would like to ask you a few things about your presentation. First of all, I would like to ask about the translation element of your work. And you use the phrase scaling down, actually. But there is always this like translation to music, not always, but in a few pieces. And you have chosen the instrument piano. Some ideas I had in my mind was like this translation, especially with the whale body, it's very much controlled. Like there is a lot of rules about how this translation can occur, and like the rules, and with cocaine too, actually. But why do you use the piano? Like, is there a specific reason, or like music or piano? How do you think about this?
Yeah, it's probably an answer. I mean, when it comes to the first time I used it for this whale battery, it was definitely very particular, and it had to do with something that I happened to live at the time very close from a very old museum, which was called the Pianola Museum, and it was one of those places where you generally see only great people entering. For no good reason. But it really showed that it was type of instrument that has a connotation of a certain time, and that was very revolutionary in a certain time, which was the early 1900s, when this was the instrument that for the first time, even prior to the vinyl industry and the record industry, it was an instrument that was able to reproduce sound without a live orchestra or live band having to play it. So just to think of that sort of reanimation, that element of being able to reproduce something that has been recorded. I think that was something that I at the time was thinking about. But apart from, let's say, that sound, I thought it was very striking already then that instrument is also able to record movement, because in that museum there were particular recordings, for instance, of Franz Liszt playing Franz Liszt, or Rachmaninoff playing Rachmaninoff. And so what you would see there is you would not only hear that recording through sound, but you would also perceive the physical, sort of the ghostly reproduction of movement. And I thought that sort of that presence that it reproduced, I thought was very powerful, and that was something that I had been wanting to in all types of ways explore with that work. And it was actually only afterwards, because this was a project that took a long time to develop. And it was only at the moment when everything, all sort of parts came together, and when it started playing, that I realized how important actually that sound became, those performances, how, since this battery is slowly discharging, the moment of the sound is actually something that is temporary, is something that will at some point not be able to reproduce anymore because the battery is out of power. Which also makes that sound very sort of, I realized like what actually, if you consider that whole process is based energy generation is based on the fact that energy does not dissolve, it transforms, right? And then to think like, what is actually the transformation after the point of the battery? And the transformation is that into sound, is that into sound vibration, and is that into a sound that actually travels inside our bodies as we hear it. Because I did not share with you the video of that performance, but it's one that does have also the sound accompanying those musical notations that I showed.
You mentioned the flow of electricity being like reminding you of flow of water, and the flow of time also comes into my mind. You know, seeing your work in its like in relation to each other. This work with the candle, actually, it's a candle that cannot be burnt, yet it's rotating on a clock module, right? Could you please elaborate a little bit more on that decision, like this work's relationship to time, this preserved energy? It's kind of like stranded in time, just like the stranded body, but it decomposes, yet this is like really stranded in time, an object that's stranded in time.
Yes, no, absolutely. It's it's something that also very interestingly came with that agreement that I had, by which I could use the material, but not. I could transform it, but I could not use it in the sense of, indeed, if I would burn it, I would not be able to put it back together. You know, it would be gone. So that was indeed. It was sort of, that was the limit of that and the restriction of working with that material. And I think very often when I encounter these limitations or these rules around the work that I'm making, I'm maybe in some way, in some points I'm disappointed, you know, I feel frustrated, but actually I always take them as cues, because it's also very often, as it was in this case, I thought it was actually mostly interesting because it shows what are the conditions. How do we as a society consider this material and let it be inside the world? What is the construct that we have shaped around it? Because of course this is also highly, cultural. In some, I mean, as we know, in some places in the world they still eat whale. So of course there the restrictions are very different. But here in the Netherlands where I live, under the restrictions of animal protection and of endangered animals such as whales, this was not allowed to burn. And indeed, to answer your question, like the fact that object has to remain whole, it cannot do the very thing that a candle is supposed to do, which is to shine, to burn. But it is able to to point to time. And I should point out there also that candles used to be among the earliest forms of time, of reading time, because of course, if you know how long a certain material takes to burn, you know how much time is left, and so there's a large sort of amount of examples where candles have actually been the guardians of time, or the communicators of time before the clock took that place.
You know, something like this time, thoughts on time, gets actually more complex in your work with the glacier. Because something we discuss a lot in this workshop is the lack of time, the catastrophe awaiting us, and human beings running out of time. Yeah, and creating electricity from that catastrophe is I have to think about it more, I guess. It is a very interesting relationship human beings have established with time.
For sure. And what is interesting to point out also, I think, there is that as with the candle being referring to this sort of potential, like it could burn certain amount of hours, but it can't. The fact that electricity and an amount of electricity is being expressed in kilowatt hours, it always has that element of duration, saying like it could have this performance over that time. So it has these different dimensions to it, even in that type of unit.
Wow, yeah. One thing I wanted to tell you during your presentation is, I think swell waves in Turkish are called ölü dalga, which means dead waves.
Dead waves?
Yeah, dead waves. Ölü dalga. So
that's interesting.
This repetition, a theme that repeats in your work is death and regeneration. Those waves are called dead waves in Turkish. So tracing them back and translating them again is also a very interesting idea, I think, in that respect too.
Absolutely, and I'm curious what a live wave is then. Like how do you decide the
dead wave it comes from somewhere else. It's like disconnected from our time. And it's disconnected from our time and context. It's the result of some other activity somewhere else, That's why they're called dead waves, I suppose, but I'm not an expert on this, of course. One last is actually, your last project differs from the other projects because there's always this translation of energy and regeneration in your other projects. Yet with the human body, the dust settles and there's contemplation over the falling apart process of the human body. I wanted to ask you, how do you think the human body regenerates or might regenerate? But then you mentioned this room being a birth room before. I don't know. Would you like to say something about this?
Well, yes, I think in that work, for sure, regeneration is a very big, is an essential part. Although the emphasis in the Buddhist tradition lays also in the dissolution, in the falling apart, rather than the building up. But of course, these are intrinsically related. And it's also something that we made a bit in our interpretation of that meditation. So the interpretation that we made in also a sound piece that I did not share now, but that was taking place in the space, like a guided meditation a bit. That definitely, we also had more of an interpretation that focuses on what continues, so apart from, let's say, DNA falling apart, also just thinking of how, and this might sound almost crude, but to think of how, or cruel, like how we are being eaten, how we become fuel. And it's something that almost comes with a certain discomfort, because we spend our lives trying to keep our body together, you know, and so it can be quite confronting to think of it and to even focus on thinking it being apart. But it's definitely, that regeneration element is definitely an essential one in this piece. In thinking along the continuation rather than the end.
Was it difficult to access the human bones in that piece?
What is very interesting is that actually it wasn't. It's of course, like how they were derived was actually probably from old, we found them on internet, and we, so also, you know, it's sort of like, it's also almost like a dissolution, like you just think, oh, so that's just where they are. But actually how they are probably derived is during, you know, if they dig a new tunnel for a metro in a city, they'll find all these type of maybe old graveyards, or just, you know, the ground is filled with traces of human life. And then if, for instance, in these cases, they'll dig up human remains, they fall under certain different res nullius, it's called, like no one's property rule. So actually they become incredibly objectified. They are not anyone's belonging anymore. And so therefore it's actually this material has become object to even legally, you know, buy and sell between people. So it's quite a strange thing. I noticed for myself that at some point I became very aware, you know, of having this material, this human material that still carried DNA, and just thinking of how it was even actually carrying more information than, for instance, the ash that you might take or might collect after someone is being cremated, a dear one, because that ash is being burned so high that not even DNA remains. So yeah, so there's those just a thought.
Well, I think we have no further questions. I would like to thank you for joining us tonight, and I would like to thank all those who watched us and will watch us later on, maybe. And I would like to thank Scout too for hosting us. And this is our last public talk, and tomorrow is the end of our workshop. Well, thank you. We will meet in the private meeting with the workshop participants. So good night, everybody. Thanks for listening.